many Aggies does it take to change a light bulb? Remember the answer? Takes 3, 1 to hold the bulb and 2 to turn the ladder. Well, I found some that satirize some of the denominations. So, at the risk of offending virtually everyone this morning, how many charismatics does it take to change a light bulb? Only takes 1. They already got their hand up in the air anyway. How many Calvinists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, Calvinists don't change light bulbs. They simply read out the instructions and pray the light bulb will decide to change itself. You'll get this one. How many Church of Christ members does it take to change a light bulb? None. They don't use light bulbs because they aren't specifically mentioned in the New Testament. Now, unfortunately, that's not a joke. I have known of congregations that had no electricity to their building because that was adding to the Word of God. True. So how many Pentecostals does it take to change a light bulb? It takes 10, only 1 to change the bulb, but then 9 to pray against the spirit of darkness. How many televangelists does it take to change a light bulb? Only 1, but the message to light, for the message of light to continue, you have to send in your contribution, right? How many Catholics does it take to change the light bulb? You should get that. How many Catholics? Well, none, of course. They use candles, don't you know? How many Episcopalians? No, it takes 3. 1 to call the electrician, 1 to mix the drinks, 1 to talk about how much better the old one was. How many Baptists? Well, at least 15. 1 to change the light bulb, and 3 committees to approve the change and decide who brings the potato salad. How many Lutherans? Oh, there's some question about this one. But we have it on good authority that they have appointed a committee to study the issue and report back at the next meeting. You'll get this one all right. How many Amish does it take to change the light bulb? What's a light bulb? How many Mormons? Well, it takes 5. It takes 1 man and then 4 wives to tell him how to do it. How many Presbyterians? None. The lights go on and off by predestination. How many United Methodists? We choose not to make a statement either in favor or against the need for a light bulb. However, if in your own journey you have found that light bulbs work for you, that's fine. Now you know. Well, good morning. It's a beautiful day. We may have some weather tonight, but it's a beautiful day today. We could use some rain. We don't mind rain. I imagine most of you are sitting here wondering, how did I get to be who I am? How did I come into existence? Well, I'm pleased to inform you that science has now definitively figured it out and have presented it in a format where it's easy for you to digest and to comprehend. I'll get it straight here in a minute. Okay. Well, never mind. I'll get to it. Okay. So here's the answer to your question. And you can't read this, but it basically is a diagram that shows you all the different epochs and all the different iterations going back to the one cell from whence you came, and all of the different ways that evolution has moved to bring you to being the person that you are. Settled science. This is the way it is. not exactly real sure exactly when it started, when the first cell decided it wanted to divide, and we have the beginning of life. Some scientists say 3 billion years ago, and different ones. And I got those numbers just by doing a Google search and just looking at the headlines on the answers that came up. And these are the ones that I found, and I'm sure there are many more. But the beginning of that varies from 3 billion years ago to 4.6 billion years ago. Well, the difference in 3 and 4.6 doesn't seem very big until you put billions with it. Do you realize that billion is a big number? If you were to decide you wanted to walk around the circumference of the earth, and you took 1 billion steps in that journey, you could go around 950 times. That's 1 billion. Now multiply that times 4.6. So the difference in 3 billion and 4.6 billion is a fairly significant number. It makes you wonder if they've really got it figured out exactly yet. But then I'm not a scientist. Of course, there are a few things that are left out of this equation, or this diagram, or visualization. They haven't told us yet what caused the first cell to reproduce. Scientists have been trying for as long as I've known, long before that, to create life. Life happens when cells reproduce. And to my knowledge, that has not yet been accomplished. Not many scientists believe that you go from one of these steps to the next step instantaneously. It's a progression. But as far as I know, the missing links, the steps between these, have not been discovered in all of the millions of fossil records that we now have. They have not accounted for the obvious design that we see in the world today. And there's even design in the way that they present it. They have not accounted for how this reconciles with the second law of thermodynamics, which says in a closed system, things don't get better, they get worse. They entropy. They become more chaotic. It doesn't explain how you overcome the problem of irreducible complexity. We live in a universe that is complex beyond imagination. We've always known it was complex, but with the advanced physics that we have in quantum physics, and I'm sure we've only taken the first baby step in discovering what is entailed in that, the level of complexity in life has gone up exponentially. And it doesn't explain the existence of morality and consciousness. So other than that, other than not knowing within 1.5 billion years of when it started, and without being able to answer any of these things, other than that, they've got it figured out. It's all settled science. There's another answer. It says, in the beginning, God created. And God said, let us make man in our own image. And that answers it all. Answers every question. And it's a whole lot simpler. And a whole lot more logical. So to our text, we have found ourselves last week in Magdala, over on the northwest coast of the Sea of Galilee, and the home of Mary Magdalene, we believe. And now they have gotten themselves into a boat and gone across the lake back in the direction of Bethsaida. And Matthew 16, verse 5 says, when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. We got a major emergency on our hands. How can you have a picnic if you don't have the bread? And in the course of going across the lake, Jesus says, be careful. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, yeast, as you know, and we've talked about this a time or two before, was a symbol to the first century Jewish population of something that was impure or corrupt due to its fermenting properties. In Jewish religious and cultural context, yeast is used to metaphorically represent sin, hypocrisy, and false teachings. The disciples know this. It's not new information to them. And Jesus says, beware of the yeast. 1 Corinthians 5, 6, and 8 says yeast is a symbol of sin. Paul urges Christians to remove the old yeast of malice and wickedness from their midst. So it's settled information. But the disciples discussed this among themselves, and here was the conclusion that they came up with in trying to understand what Jesus is talking about. They said, he's saying this because we forgot to bring bread. They kind of missed it. Wherever their discussion, Jesus asked, you of little faith, why are you talking amongst yourselves about having no bread? Do you not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I'm not talking to you about bread? I'm not worried about whether you brought bread in the boat or not. We're not going to starve to death. It's okay. But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then they finally understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So when you have trouble understanding Scripture, and all of a sudden it dawns on you, hey, I really got that wrong. Don't beat yourself up. Just remember the disciples had a pretty good go at it in the first century as well. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus said, do you see anything? This is a really strange story to me. We've got some similarity here. He's already, he's putting the hands on the man that he's going to heal. He's using the saliva again, just as he did with the deaf man who had who was mute. And he heals the man, and he says, do you see anything? You remember the rest of the story? The man looked up and said, I see people, they look like trees walking around. Is Jesus just having a bad day? What's going on here? Always when Jesus heals, what happens? It's immediate and complete. But here's not. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. Of course, he always tells them this, and they never do it. But anyway, he's trying to keep from creating so much crowd around him, so much attention to him that things happen before their time. Really interesting story, and I don't begin to understand it all. some things we might think about. They were in Bethsaida, and Bethsaida was one of the places where Jesus didn't do many miracles. He said because of lack of faith. Chorazin, I believe, was the other. It's reasonable that he would lead the blind man. That was a courteous thing to do since the blind man couldn't see. I think we can conclude that the blind man probably wasn't born blind, because when he got the partial vision, he equated what he saw with trees, which would imply that he knew what a tree looked like. And I think we have to still remember that in all of this and everything that Jesus is doing, there is the element of teaching his apostles, instructing them, bringing them along. But it's still an interesting and a strange story. Why did it take Jesus 2 times to heal him? David? I think this is unique in Jesus' miracles as far as we know.
I think you put the answer up there already, but I don't think it took Jesus 2 times to heal him. I think that he's trying to drive home the point that he did earlier about the leaven and the bread. Well, we didn't bring any bread. And Jesus says, well, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, but we didn't bring any bread. Don't you understand? So Jesus, I think, is doing this here. The first time he does the healing, he's showing the disciples, well, you only partly got it. You only partly see what's going on. And now I'm going to actually do the healing, and then the blind man can see. And I think that is why these two are juxtaposed with the bread and the leaven of the Pharisees, and taking 2 times to be able to, for the blind man to see properly. I think this was really, like you said, was Jesus actually showing the disciples, I can heal all, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to see.
Progression. Yeah. Anybody else? What are some other ideas? Well, I don't know the answer. I mean, that's as good as any for me. But maybe created a progression of faith by a blind man who apparently had no faith. I don't know that we can say that, but I mean, the blind man didn't cry out to Jesus. He didn't come to Jesus. He was brought by his friends to Jesus. There's no indication that he had faith at all. But maybe this was a building of faith. Hey, it worked a little bit. Maybe it'll work more. I don't know. Jesus is demonstrating to his disciples that spiritual vision is a process, kind of what David was saying. It's available light. Light becoming increasingly available. Isn't that the way we learn? Don't we learn by steps? Jesus is demonstrating to his disciples that spiritual vision is a process. He had just criticized their lack of understanding. As David said, you don't get it. Okay, well, let's walk through this again. Maybe we should never assume that because we see some truth, we therefore see all truth. Now, when I was 18, I had all truth. And if you didn't believe it, just ask me. Even younger than that. I've told you this before, but when I was in high school, I set out, I had a serious project. I went to the 5 and 10 cent store and bought a little index box and a whole stack of cards. And I began in Genesis, and I was going to write out in very plain English the commands of God, so that everybody would understand finally what God wanted them to do. But the only time I had to do it, because I was in high school and had to be, and I had to get up early in the morning, catch the bus, and then when I got home, I had to work in the field. So the only time I had to do it was before breakfast. And I don't do mornings. I lasted about 3 days. If it hadn't been for that, you all would have known what God wanted you to do. I'm sorry I failed you in that. Maybe we should be a little understanding and a little patient with others who may not yet be where we are in seeing clearly. I'm reminded of Paul's statement at the end of the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. We see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see, even as we are also seen. I really think available light explains a lot of things. Another metaphor that we can draw from this is the second touch. Sometimes we need a second touch. Have you ever been that person that needed a second touch? David certainly did after his adultery and murder. Peter certainly did after denying Jesus 3 times, and Jesus gave it to him, didn't he? He gave him 3 opportunities to say how much he loved him. Paul certainly needed a second touch after being a persecutor and a killer of Christians. And we could add to that list all morning. And I expect most of us in here can think of a time when we needed a second touch. And we're very, very happy that we had it. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say Jeremiah and one of the other prophets. And he asked him, "But who do you say that I am?" Okay. You know it had to happen, so today's the day. It's soapbox time. We're coming to Matthew 16 and 18, Matthew 16, 16 through 18. Those of you who have been with me for a long time have heard it all before. You're going to hear it again. Those of you who haven't, well, you're just going to have to be patient. I underlined region. They're down in Bethsaida, Capernaum, that area right on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. And for no apparent reason, Jesus is going to take his apostles and he's going to walk something like 26 miles up to Caesarea Philippi, right on the Syrian border. Now, the records, Matthew says they went to the region of Caesarea Philippi. I don't know if they went into Caesarea Philippi or not. It was, as you'll see as we went along, it's questionable, and we could argue it either way. Caesarea Philippi was the place where Pan was worshipped. And you've heard Rick talk about this too. Pan is this half human, half goat. He's lecherous, immoral Greek god, mythological god. And he's just about as immoral, despicable as you can imagine. And the city of Caesarea Philippi was dedicated to his worship. It existed for his worship. It was also named Caesarea Paneas after Pan. It was ruled by the Greek Seleucids. The Seleucids were the successors of Alexander the Great. Took over his empire, divided it among about 3 of their main generals. Herod came in there and built a temple to his patron, Caesar, That's where the Caesarea comes from, honoring Caesar. Philip II made it his capital. He put Caesar's image on his coins. For a good Jew, Caesarea Philippi is not where you go for a picnic. I took this picture of a sign there. I've been to Caesarea Philippi 3 times, and it's a fascinating place. Now, this is a picture that's on a sign there at the site, and this is an artist's depiction of what it probably looked like, and I expect it is not too far off. There's a temple there for Caesar, and the main temple there is for Pan, and then the rock areas there are where the orgies and the obscene rituals occurred in the worship of Pan. And right behind the temple on the left, you can see a hole back there. That is the gate of hell. Actually, Hades, but in King James, it's the gate of hell. So this is where Jesus is taking his apostles. This is a picture of it today with the gate, the big opening on the left. Now, when Jesus was there, water was gushing out of that and into the little stream below it. And water was considered to be the dwelling place of the Hadean forces. The little alcoves there were places where statues would be put. And of course, the temple is long gone. This is a little stream flowing out of that would originally receive the water from the gates of hell, but now it's been diverted because of some earthquakes over the years. But it's still a very beautiful little stream. So Jesus has said, "Who do men say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because you did not learn this from any human being. My Father in heaven has revealed this to you." And now comes the verse. "Now I say unto you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So it reads in King James. That one verse has been the basis of so many doctrines, so many teachings over the years. We'll break it down a little bit, and we'll break it down further as we go on. And so, reading it inserting some of the Greek and inserting a number of different translations. Now, I say to you that you are Petros, and we'll explain that. And upon this petra, 2 completely different Greek words, I will build my ecclesia. Some translations say church, congregation, or assembly, and almost all English translations say church. And the gates, or the powers, or the forces of hell, the Greek word is Hades. The Hebrew word is Sheol, will not, katashua, will not conquer, prevail, overpower, or get the upper hand against it. Well, that's a lot to unpack. So Jesus says, I say unto you, Peter, I say unto you that you are Petros, Peter, a pebble, a stone. And upon this petra, this large boulder, huge rock, I will build my church. This is a picture of Petra in Jordan, the city of Petra. It was once a city. It's no longer inhabited. Now tourists go there. It really takes an overnight trip from Israel to get to Petra and back. I haven't been, but a lot of my friends have. I'd love to have gone. But they're not the same word. And Jesus says, upon this rock, upon this Petra. So the question becomes, what is that rock Jesus is talking about? Now, if you're a good Catholic, what's the rock? Peter. Peter is a rock. And this is one of their main proof texts for establishing Peter as the first Pope of Rome. And all following men who occupy that position are a descendant of that first Pope. Some other ideas that are presented is that the rock Jesus is talking about is the confession that Peter has just made. What was the confession? You are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Some commentators say that the rock that he's talking about is himself. Jesus is the rock. Well, that's certainly a metaphor that we see all through Scripture, Old and New, usually in the form of a cornerstone rock. Jesus is the cornerstone that was rejected by the builders. But I would propose to you and ask you to consider the possibility that Jesus is either standing in Caesarea Philippi or near it, looking down at it, this pagan, corrupt place. And what he said was, upon this rock, right in the middle of the worst the world has to offer, I'm going to call out my sacred community. Now, is accepting the rock as Peter's confession good? Certainly. Certainly the church is based on the fact that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And I think that's what most of us grew up with, right? That was built on, that the rock was the confession that Peter made. That's okay. Got no problem with that. Was the rock Jesus himself? Well, certainly. So I'm not arguing with any of that. The only one I would argue with was the first one. Peter was certainly not the first pope. I mean, well, they said he's the first pope, but that's not what Jesus said. And we'll unpack that some more. But after having been there and looked at it, and they say the difference in reading the Bible without ever having been to Israel and reading the Bible after going to Israel is that the Bible goes from 2-dimension to 3-dimension. You have a 3-dimensional understanding of what you're reading. And I think that's really true of Caesarea Philippi. Because in the context of it, the rock was right in front of them, and it was tangible, and it represented the church, the sacred community, as being right in the middle of the hurting, corrupt, lost world. That's my idea. David?
So if I'm understanding you right, not just the area that they were standing, but this is just, he's looking at them and saying, as a metaphor to the whole planet, that the worst of the worst is where I'm going to bring my people up.
That's the way I'm reading it.
I'm by that. That sounds great.
And again, I have no, I'm not arguing that the other is necessarily right or wrong. I mean, and there's certainly nothing bad about saying the church is built on the confession of Peter. But to me, in the context of it, standing there and reading those words, looking at where he was and why he was there, to me, I think he was talking about that rock. Now, the other is fine, but this is the way the voice puts this particular passage. Simon, son of Jonah, your knowledge is a mark of blessing, for you didn't learn this truth from your friends or from teachers or from sages you've met on the way. You learned it from my Father in heaven. This is why I have called you Peter, for on this petra rock, projected large stone, I will build my, they say church, I say ecclesia. The ecclesia will reign triumphant even at the gates of hell. We're going to see the rest of that broken out now too. So Jesus said, upon this rock, I will build. I will build. Whose church is it? Whose church is it?
He says, I will build my church.
No, he didn't say that. He said, I will build my ecclesia. And we're not going to get into that much today, but we will next week, so you probably won't want to come. But we're going to get into that deeply. Whose church is it? We got up this morning and we came to church, right? I used to, growing up, I used to say, it's wrong to say I'm going to church. You can't go to church because you are the church. I have repented of that. We do go to church. I came to church this morning, and so did you. I can join it or not, as I choose. The church can decide to admit me or not. Some churches have really stringent rules for membership. I grew up in churches where, you pretty much needed to look like and smell like me or you couldn't come. And we'd make laws to make sure that happened. I'm happy that Southeast is not in that category now, but many churches are. I can go to it. It has an address. It has a website. How did we ever have churches without websites? I don't know how anybody ever found anybody. They can change the name, and I'm still a member of that church. We could change the name of Southeast Church of Christ to something else, and it would still be my church. I would still be able to come here. I can serve this church in many ways. Right? I can sweep the floors. I can contribute to it. I can mow the lawn. Or I can pay somebody to do it like we do. If the church displeases me, I can leave and go to another church. A lot of people do. Happens all the time. If this church is destroyed, closed, or sold, I'm no longer a member here because this church no longer exists. Whose church is it? It's my church. I'm making the statement that Jesus never built a church. And I'm going to unpack that for you in some detail next week. For some people, I know it will sound like a bunch of semantics. Okay, church, sacred community, church, sacred community. It's just words. To me, it's a fundamental thing, and it explains so much. It explains the atrocities of the Middle Ages, the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition. It explains the atrocities of the Reformation and the evolving of hundreds of different denominations. It explains the divisions and splits within the Church of Christ, for example. And we've had probably 75 or 100 splits in our fellowship. And it makes everything make sense. If I can come to understand that it's my church, and that's not bad of itself, but it's human, and human things have faults. Human things have weaknesses. But the tension comes when we try to make my church the sacred community, and we try to proof text our way into making a human organization a divine organization, and not understanding the difference in those two. And that's where we get all of our fighting and all of our division and all of the bad things that people criticize about the church, and many of it rightfully so. Now, that's a lot to digest, and we're going to go to this passage in Scripture and try to unpack that more for you, Lord willing, next week. Did you have a comment, David? We'd love to have it. We got a couple of minutes left, and I don't want to go any further than this today because we won't even get started.
Yeah, I think back to the history of the Babylonian captivity, and the synagogue, as it was in Jesus' day, basically started out during that period of time because they didn't have a temple that they could go to. So small groups of people would gather together to worship. And we see the same sort of thing in the early church. And both of those being groups of people, they had problems. The synagogue basically became an institution. And it had people like the ruler of the synagogue, archysynagogos, who basically set the rules for what could or couldn't happen. And then, of course, you had the Pharisees, who would be the teachers of the law, who would kind of dominate all of the teaching that would go on. So what originally happened as people gathering together to worship God became an imposed type of thing. Again, you see the same sort of evolution with the early church. And I think that people a lot of times don't see that, and I really appreciate you bringing out the fact that what humans do to something that God has tried to create.
Yeah. And there's a place for the church. There is a place for the church. If the church wasn't here, it would be a whole different. The church is not essential to our service to God, but it is helpful. And we have done more by being organized into even this human organization, where we pool our resources, where we come together in a convenient way to have fellowship. So I'm not anti-church in any way. I work for one. But we need to differentiate between the church and what Jesus built. Because he built something. He built something. Upon this rock I will build. And he did. And the gates of hell have never prevailed against it. And never will. And that's what we want to unpack next week. Time's up. God bless you. Have a wonderful God bless week.